I got a call before sunrise telling me my daughter-in-law had been rushed to the ICU. She arrived alone. No husband. No emergency contact answering the phone. Just machines keeping her alive while the man who promised to stand by her was nowhere to be found. I drove to the hospital expecting panic excuses, something that made sense. What I found instead was absence and silence that felt deliberate. Later that same day, I saw my son doing something else entirely, living as if nothing inside those hospital walls mattered. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. I didn't yell. I didn't confront him in public. I didn't try to scare him straight. I made one quiet decision that changed everything. A decision that didn't hurt him with anger, but with truth. This is not a story about revenge the way people imagine it. It's about what happens when a father stops protecting a grown man from the consequences of abandoning his family. My name is Daniel, and this is the hardest lesson I ever had to teach my own son. The morning was quiet in the way life gets after you think you have already survived the hardest parts. I was standing in my kitchen in Naperville watching the coffee finish dripping, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator. 3 years had passed since I sold my construction company, and most days now moved at a steady, predictable pace. I still woke up early. I still liked order. I just no longer had fires to put out. The phone rang sharp and sudden against the stillness. I almost ignored it. When I answered, I heard Susan Miller from 2 houses down. Her voice was tight, like she was holding it together for someone else. She said Laura had been taken to the hospital early that morning. An ambulance, sirens. She said it all happened fast. Then she said something that made me grip the counter. Laura was alone when they took her. I asked where they had taken her, and Susan told me Northwestern Memorial in Chicago. She said she tried calling my son Brian, but did not get an answer. She apologized for bothering me so early. I told her thank you and ended the call. Brian had not called me. I stood there for a moment, phone still in my hand. I told myself not to jump ahead. Laura had been sick for a long time. Things happened quickly with her condition. There were explanations that made sense if you lined them up carefully. Still, something felt wrong in a way I could not explain yet. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The drive into the city blurred past. Traffic thickened, then loosened again. I noticed how calm my hands were on the steering wheel. No shaking, no rush. Just that same pressure settling in my chest, heavier with every mile. I called Brian once while stopped at a red light. It went to voicemail. I did not leave a message. At the hospital, the air smelled like disinfectant and coffee that had been sitting too long. I gave Laura's name at the desk and followed the directions to the intensive care unit. The hallway lights were too bright. The floor gleamed in a way that made every step feel louder than it was. Laura lay still in the bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and clicked with mechanical patience. Tubes ran from her arms and into places I did not want to look at too closely. Her face looked smaller than I remembered, her skin pale against the white sheets. There was no jacket tossed over a chair, no bag on the floor, no sign that anyone had rushed in with her. A nurse named Karen Lopez noticed me standing there and came over. She spoke calmly, explaining Laura's condition and what the doctors were doing. She asked if I was her father. I told her I was her father-in-law. Karen nodded and continued mentioning that Laura had arrived several hours earlier. She said it again without emphasis. Laura had come in alone. No emergency contact answered at first. They eventually reached Susan using a number from Laura's phone. I thanked her and pulled a chair closer to the bed. I sat down and took Laura's hand. It felt colder than it should have. I rubbed my thumb gently against her knuckles the way she used to do when she was nervous. Laura had always been that way, quietly attentive. The kind of person who noticed when you skipped lunch and slid a sandwich toward you without making a show of it. When I was recovering from surgery years back, she had stopped by with soup and stayed long enough to make sure I actually ate it. She never called me by my first name. It was always Mr. Harper, even after I told her she did not have to. There was respect in that. I had liked her from the beginning. I told myself Brian might still show up. Traffic, a dead phone, a mistake. I sat there longer than I realized, listening to the rhythm of the machines and the soft footsteps of nurses moving in and out of nearby rooms. Eventually, I stepped into the hallway and tried Brian again. This time he answered. There was noise behind his voice. Music, maybe. People talking. He sounded distracted, like I had caught him in the middle of something he did not want to stop. I told him where I was and what had happened. There was a pause. Not shock, not worry. Just a pause long enough to register. He said he was busy and would come by later. He did not ask how Laura was doing. He did not ask how serious it was. He said later the way someone talks about rescheduling a meeting. I ended the call without arguing and went back into the room. Laura's breathing remained steady but shallow. At one point, her fingers twitched slightly in my hand, barely enough to notice. The monitor changed rhythm for a second, then settled again. A nurse passed by and said softly that sometimes patients reacted to familiar voices, even when they were not fully conscious. I leaned closer and told Laura I was there. Hours passed. The light outside the narrow window shifted the gray of morning, giving way to a pale afternoon. Brian did not arrive. No message came through. I stood in the doorway of the ICU and watched other families gather. Some whispered. Some cried openly. Some argued quietly with doctors. They leaned into one another, forming small circles of shared worry. I felt separate from all of it, like I was watching from the wrong side of the glass. That was when the thought finally settled in, clear and uncomfortable. Absence is not always an accident. Sometimes it is a decision. I did not yet know what that decision would cost, or what it would demand from me in return. I only knew that something had shifted while I stood there listening to the steady rhythm of machines. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just enough to change the direction of everything that came after. I went back to Laura's side and sat down again, my hand resting lightly over hers, waiting. I drove back towards the hospital with Laura's bag on the passenger seat. My eyes fixed on the road, but my mind replaying the same images over and over. Brian smiling behind the wheel, the music shaking the windows, the way he did not look back. At a red light, my phone buzzed again. For a second, I hoped it was him saying he was on his way. It was another short message instead. Still dealing with personal stuff. I'll explain later. Later again. I did not reply. I set the phone face down and waited for the light to change. By the time I reached the hospital parking garage, my thoughts had drifted backward, the way they do when something in the present refuses to make sense. I kept asking myself how I had raised a son who could do what I had just seen. Not in a dramatic way. Quietly. Methodically. Like a man checking his own work for mistakes. I worked hard when Brian was growing up. Construction does not leave much room for shortcuts, and neither did I. I believed in showing up even when you were tired, finishing what you started, and taking responsibility when things went wrong. I taught him how to shake a man's hand properly, how to stand up when an older woman entered the room, how to look someone in the eye when you spoke. When he was 12, he shattered a neighbor's window with a baseball and swore it was not him. I did not argue. I walked him across the street, stood behind him, while he admitted it, and told him he would work it off until the cost was paid. He hated me for that. slammed doors, barely spoke for weeks. But after that day, he owned his mistakes. Or at least I believed he did. I was not the kind of father who hovered. I did not ask where he was every night. I did not read his messages or question his friendships. When he married Laura, I stepped back even further. Men are supposed to respect that boundary. You do not interfere with your son's marriage unless there is blood on the floor or someone asks for help, Laura asked once. It was early on after dinner at our place. She stayed behind while Brian went out to the car. She did not accuse him of anything. She did not complain. She just said he shuts down sometimes when things get hard, and she wondered if that was how he had always been. She asked if I had any advice. I told her he would figure it out. I said marriage takes patience. I said the kinds of things men say when they want to believe problems solve themselves. Standing in the elevator on my way back up to the ICU, I realized how easy that answer had been for me. When I reached Laura's room, Karen was adjusting one of the lines. She nodded when she saw me and asked if I had found what I needed. I placed the bag on the chair and thanked her. I asked again if Brian had called or come by. She shook her head gently and told me sometimes people freeze when things get serious. She said it kindly, like she was trying to soften something sharp. I nodded and let it go. My phone buzzed again a few minutes later. Another text from Brian. "Stop stressing. I've got it handled." I stared at the words longer than I should have. Handled meant different things to different people. To me, it meant showing up. To Brian, it seemed to mean avoiding what made him uncomfortable and trusting that someone else would pick up the slack. I remembered signing the paperwork for the SUV 2 years earlier. Brian had come to me after a bad quarter at work, said interest rates were killing him, said it would only be temporary. I believed him. I told myself helping your son was not the same as rescuing him. I told myself I was doing the responsible thing. Now I wondered if I had simply made it easier for him to walk away. I stepped into the hallway to get a breath of air and saw a family gathered near the nurse's station. A woman cried quietly into her husband's shoulder while he spoke with a doctor, his free hand gripping a folded jacket. They looked exhausted but united. I felt a familiar ache settle in my chest, not envy exactly, but recognition of what should have been. When I returned to Laura's room, she stirred slightly. Her fingers moved against the sheet. I leaned closer and spoke her name. Her eyelids fluttered, but did not open. The monitor shifted briefly, then steadied. It was not much, but it was enough to remind me she was still here. I stayed another hour. Brian did not arrive. As evening settled in, the hospital lights took on that artificial glow that makes time feel suspended. I sat and thought about the choices I had made as a father. The times I stepped back because it seemed like the right thing to do. The times I trusted Brian to be the man I thought I had raised. What unsettled me most was not the woman in the passenger seat, or the music, or the messages. It was how easy it all seemed for him. How natural. When I finally stood to leave Laura's room for the night, I paused in the doorway and looked back at her. She lay there quietly, her life depending on machines and strangers, while the man who vowed to stand by her was somewhere else entirely. I walked down the hallway with Laura's bag in my hand, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. If this was who my son had become when no one was watching, then the problem was larger than one bad decision. And I had a growing sense that what came next would force me to face my own part in it, whether I wanted to or not. I waited 3 days before I did anything that could not be taken back. That had been my rule when I ran the company. Decisions made too fast were usually made twice. In those 3 days, Brian did not come to the hospital. He sent messages instead. Short ones. Sparse, always written like he was keeping a connection alive without having to show up. "How is she doing?" "Busy today." I answered each time with facts. Stable. Not much change. Doctors watching closely. His replies came back quickly, then nothing. It felt like he wanted proof of concern without the weight of it. Laura moved in small steps forward and back. One morning, a nurse smiled and said her oxygen levels looked better. By afternoon, a fever set in and the room filled with purposeful quiet. I learned the rhythms: when to sit, when to stand, when to step aside. I watched the doorway more than the monitors. Brian never walked through it. By the fourth day, the pattern stopped feeling like bad luck. It felt chosen. I went home that night and did what I had avoided with my son for years. I looked. Not to accuse, to understand. I opened the account I kept for family emergencies, the one Brian knew existed and had access to if he needed help. The numbers told a story without drama. Small cash withdrawals, transfers that did not line up with bills, charges at places I did not recognize. Not outrageous on their own. Together, they felt urgent. Then I saw the payday loan. It dated back to the fall of 2023. Automatic debits every 2 weeks, precise as a clock. The amounts were modest, which made it worse. This was not a single bad decision. It was a habit. Interest stacking on interest, the kind of hole people dig when they believe tomorrow will save them. I checked the credit cards next. 2 of them. Both past due. Late fees sitting on top of late fees. I did not feel shock. I felt a steady tightening in my chest. This was not debt from groceries or gas. This was debt from running. I sat at the kitchen table with the laptop open and the house dark around me, trying to picture Brian's life as it really was. Not the version he showed at holidays. Not the version he told coworkers. The quiet one he lived when no one was watching. The next morning, I asked the nurse if Laura's husband had been there overnight. She shook her head without hesitation. She had answered that question too many times. I tried calling Brian again. No answer. I called someone who had no reason to protect me or him. Ethan Caldwell. Brian had mentioned him once as a work friend, someone he grabbed drinks with after late days. I had met Ethan briefly years earlier. He struck me as careful, the kind of man who chose his words. He answered on the second ring. When I told him who I was, he paused, then exhaled. I asked how Brian had been at work. Ethan said he was not sure how to say it without making things worse. I told him to say it anyway. He said Brian had been telling people Laura was basically gone, like it was already settled, like he was preparing them. He said Brian talked about staying strong and not being able to live in a hospital. He said Brian believed Laura would not want him to stop living his life. I listened without interrupting. That last part sounded like something Brian might tell himself until it felt true. Ethan hesitated again, and then said there was more. He said Brian had been bringing a woman around after work. Not openly, not proudly, casually, like it was normal and people would understand if they knew the circumstances. I thanked Ethan and ended the call. I stood in the kitchen until the kettle began to whistle and realized I had not turned the stove off. I did not feel jealousy. I felt something colder, embarrassment, for the name he carried, for the vows he made, for the way he was already rewriting the story to suit himself. I went back through what I knew. The woman in the SUV, the music, the easy smile, the messages telling me to stop stressing, the debt that came from chasing relief instead of solving problems. That afternoon, I asked Susan if she had noticed anyone coming and going at the townhouse before the ambulance arrived. She said she had seen a young woman there once or twice, always parked a little down the street, never waving. She described her hair, her height, the way she moved. It matched what I had seen. The name came to me 2 days later in the most ordinary way. Brian's phone was still linked to the family tablet account I had set up years earlier. I had forgotten. He had too. A notification flashed while I was checking Laura's email for a message from her doctor. Madison H. dinner tonight. I did not call the number. I did not confront Brian. I did not raise my voice in hospital hallways. I kept my face steady and my voice calm because this was no longer about cheating. It was abandonment. A man stepping away from a dying wife while building a story that made him the victim. That night I sat beside Laura and told her I was there. Her eyes did not open, but her breathing shifted. Her fingers moved against the blanket like she was reaching for something just out of range. I remembered Brian as a child, afraid of hospitals, clinging to my hand before a routine procedure. I remembered telling him he did not have to be brave, just present. As I watched Laura, the final piece settled into place. Brian was not lost. He was choosing, again and again, choosing comfort over responsibility, choosing a new narrative over the truth. On my way out, I stopped in the lobby and read the list of numbers near the information desk. Legal services, patient advocacy, family support. Clean black letters on a white board. I stood there longer than I meant to, feeling the shape of what had to come next. When I stepped into the cold night air, I knew my next call would not be to my son. It would be to someone who understood paper and consequences, because this pattern would not stop on its own. The morning after I stood in the hospital lobby reading those phone numbers, I woke before dawn and already knew what I was going to do. There was no anger in it, no rush. Just a sense of sequence, like lining up tools on a workbench before starting a job you had been putting off too long. I made coffee and let it cool while I sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam rising from the mug. Then I picked up the phone and called Rachel Bennett. Rachel had handled the sale of my company and a few property matters over the years. She was efficient, precise, and not interested in drama. When she answered, she recognized my voice right away. I told her I needed to understand my options. I did not say I wanted to stop my son. I said I needed to protect someone who could not protect herself. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked questions in a calm, methodical way. Who held title to the house? Whose name was on the vehicles? Whether any powers of attorney existed? Whether Laura had ever mentioned feeling pressured to sign anything. Each question felt like a door opening to a room I had avoided walking into. We agreed to meet that afternoon. Her office was quiet, the kind of place where time felt measured. Sunlight filtered through tall windows onto shelves lined with binders that all looked identical. Rachel spread documents across the table and explained things in plain language. What I could do immediately, what required notice, what required patience. There was a pause when she asked if Brian had ever sent me paperwork recently. Anything that seemed routine, anything that asked for authority. I remembered the document from months earlier sent casually framed as a formality. I had skimmed it and felt uneasy, told him I wanted to read it more carefully. He never followed up. I forwarded it to Rachel. She read it slowly, her finger tracing lines of text. When she looked up, her expression had changed just enough to make my stomach tighten. The language reached further than it should have. Not enough to accuse. Enough to raise concern. Enough to suggest intent without proof. She told me this did not mean my son had committed a crime. It meant my instincts had been justified. Rachel said we needed to move carefully, quietly. Paper first. No confrontations. No warnings. The law worked best when emotions stayed out of it. The first step was the SUV. Rachel explained that since the title was still in my name, I had the right to revoke permission. I called the bank from her office. The representative placed me on hold for several minutes while she verified information. I waited, listening to tinny music, feeling the weight of the delay. When she came back on the line, her tone was neutral. The request would be processed. It would take effect by the end of the day. I hung up and realized my hands were steady. The second step involved the trust. Most of my assets were already protected, but there were gaps. Rachel prepared the documents to move anything that could be used as leverage into a structure designed to safeguard Laura's interests. This took time. There were forms to review, signatures to notarize, a follow-up appointment when one detail did not align. It was not instant. It was real. The third step brought me back to the hospital. I met with patient services in a small office away from the noise of the ICU. I explained that Laura was incapacitated and that there were concerns about her husband's involvement. I did not accuse. I presented facts, documents, timelines. They listened, asked questions, and reviewed their policies. Nothing was done hastily. Nothing was done publicly. Together we updated the list of approved visitors. This was described clearly as a temporary measure, a precaution. That distinction mattered. I signed where I needed to sign and left copies where they were requested. That evening my phone began to buzz. Missed calls. Messages that shifted from irritation to confusion. The tone changed quickly once something he relied on was no longer available. I did not answer. I did not explain. Silence was not punishment. It was boundary. Over the next 2 days, the changes became visible. The SUV did not appear outside the townhouse. Brian's messages slowed, then stopped. The woman whose presence had hovered at the edges of this mess disappeared entirely, as if her interest had been tied to access rather than affection. I spent my time between the hospital and Rachel's office. There were moments of waiting that tested my patience. A document that needed one more verification. A clerk who asked me to come back the next morning. Each delay forced me to sit with the weight of what I was doing. I welcomed that. If this was going to change everything, it deserved to be felt. On the third visit to Rachel's office, she slid one final document across the table. She told me to take my time. I looked at my name printed at the bottom of the page. I thought about Brian as a child holding my hand outside a clinic room, afraid of the smell and the sounds. I thought about Laura lying in the ICU, breathing with help, still reaching for something solid. I thought about the moments I had stepped back when I should have leaned in. I picked up the pen and paused. This was not about control. It was about responsibility. About making sure silence and absence could not do more damage. I signed. I did not feel relief. I felt a line being drawn clean and irreversible. That night I returned to the hospital. Laura was resting. Her breathing was steady. I sat with her for a while and told her nothing about what I had done. This was not a burden she needed to carry. As I stood to leave, my phone buzzed once more. A single message from Brian, stripped of confidence and anger. "What is going on?" I slipped the phone back into my pocket and walked down the hallway, aware that from this moment forward, every choice would land differently, and there would be no pretending otherwise. By the time I reached the parking garage, my phone was vibrating again. Then again. The same number over and over, as if persistence could drag me back into the old arrangement where I solved problems and my son stayed clean. I did not answer while I drove. I kept my eyes on the road and let the ringing fill the quiet. When I pulled into my driveway, the screen showed a stack of missed calls and a chain of texts that got sharper with each one. "Call me back." "What did you do? This is not funny. I need the car. You have no right." I read that last line twice, not because I was surprised, but because it said everything he believed about the world. that my help was his, that my name on paper was just decoration. I stepped inside and set my keys on the counter. The hospital smell still clung to my jacket. Disinfectant and something metallic that never quite leaves your nose. I poured a glass of water and drank it slowly, then called Rachel. She answered like she expected it. I told her Brian was calling nonstop. Rachel said it was predictable. When access disappears, people show what they actually depended on. She told me not to argue on the phone. If he wanted a conversation, he could have it in person when I chose the time and place. She reminded me to stick to facts. No accusations, no threats, paper and boundaries. I thanked her and hung up. My phone rang again, immediately. This time I answered. Brian's voice came through hard, loud, already halfway into anger. "Dad, what is going on? The car is not working. The bank is calling me. What did you tell them?" I kept my voice even. I told him the SUV was titled in my name, and he no longer had permission to use it. There was a short laugh, sharp and empty. "You cannot do that," he said. "I need it. I have things to handle. I said you should have handled your wife." A pause followed, long enough for me to hope for one small second that the truth might land. Instead, his tone changed. It softened into something that sounded practiced. "You do not know what it is like," he said. "You are not living this. I have been dealing with it for months. I cannot breathe in that hospital. It messes with my head. Laura would not want me sitting there watching her fade." He almost sounded like he believed himself, like he had said those words so many times that they began to feel like a reason instead of an excuse. Then the real concern surfaced, quick and desperate. "My cards are getting declined," he said. "The dealership called. I have people on me, Dad. I am getting hit from every side. I just need you to fix this." I listened not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to hear how fast his worry for Laura turned into worry for himself. It took less than a minute. "None of this would be happening if she did not get sick," he said. "Do you realize what this has cost me? Do you realize what I have had to give up?" My jaw tightened. I said, "Laura did not choose this. You did. You," he swore under his breath. Then the anger drained and something raw pushed through. Not remorse. Fear. The kind that makes a person talk too fast. "Dad." "I am serious," he said. "I cannot lose everything. I have payments. I have debt. I cannot have this happen right now." That was the first honest thing he said, and it was still only about him. I stayed quiet long enough that I could hear his breathing on the line. It sounded shallow, unsteady, like the mask had slipped and there was nothing behind it but panic. Then he tried another angle. "Please," he said, "just tell me what you did. Undo it. I will come tomorrow. I will go to the hospital. I will do whatever you want." I said no. He went silent, and I could almost hear him recalculating. The shift was subtle, like a salesman trying to find the right pitch. "You are doing this because you hate me," he said. "Because you want to control everything. You always wanted to control everything." That one hit in a different place. Not because it was true, but because it was the story he had carried for years. The strict father, the impossible standard, the man who never softened. I thought about the day he broke a window at 12 and tried to deny it. I thought about walking him across the street and making him own it. I thought about how he looked at me then like I had betrayed him by refusing to lie with him. I said, "I am not doing this because I hate you. I am doing it because Laura deserves protection and you have proven you will not give it." His voice rose again. "She is not innocent," he snapped. "She makes everything harder. She is always judging me. She is always acting like I am the problem." I ended the call. My hand did not shake, but my chest felt tight, like my body was bracing for a second impact. I stared at the dark screen and understood something ugly. I had been waiting for my son to be frightened into doing the right thing. What I was hearing was a man frightened into finding someone to blame. The next call came from a number I recognized, but had not seen in years. Thomas Reed, my brother-in-law. He had married my late sister and carried that particular confidence some men develop when they like giving advice more than they like listening. He did not ask how Laura was. He asked what I was doing. He said he heard I cut Brian off. He said family does not do that to family. He said Brian was under stress and people make mistakes. He said I was making things worse. I let him talk. I did not argue. When he finally paused, I told him Laura was in an ICU bed and my son had not shown up once. Thomas hesitated. It was a small sound, but I heard it. He said Brian told him he was there all the time. I said that was a lie. Thomas's voice tightened. He warned me people would talk. He warned me the family would not forgive me if something happened. He said I was going to destroy my own son. I said my son was doing a fine job of destroying himself. Then I ended the call. That night a text came in from Brian. "I'm sorry. It should have moved me." It did not. It felt like a tool pulled from a drawer when the others failed. An apology that cost him nothing, timed to soften me before he asked again. I did not respond. The following afternoon, I was back at the hospital. The nurse told me Laura's vitals had been steadier. Not a miracle. A small step that felt like a light turning on in a long hallway. I sat beside her and held her hand, watching her face, listening to the quiet work of the machines. For a moment, her fingers curled around mine. Weak but deliberate. My throat tightened. I leaned closer and said her name. Her eyelids fluttered, not opening, but trying. That small effort did something to me. It made the situation stop being abstract. It made it personal in a way it had not even when I saw the SUV rolling past the townhouse. When I stepped into the hallway, Karen caught my eye and told me someone had been at the desk asking about visiting. She kept her voice low. She did not have to say his name. She asked if he was approved. I breathed in slowly. I pictured Brian's blame, his panic, the way he spoke about Laura like she was an obstacle. I pictured Laura's fingers tightening around mine like she was holding on to the only steady thing she could find. I also pictured the other side of this, the part no one would see, the part where a father makes a decision his son may never forgive, the part where I would live with that even if it was the right call. I said he is not to be let in right now. Karen nodded once, no judgment in her face, only professionalism. I walked toward the elevators with my phone silent in my pocket. I knew Brian would come in person soon, and when he did, there would be no room left for him to hide behind messages or excuses or the word later. I got to the hospital early the next morning, not because I expected a miracle, but because I wanted the day to begin on my terms. The waiting room was quieter before the coffee carts rolled through, before families clustered in corners, before the air filled with that restless mix of hope and fear. I checked in at the desk and spoke softly with the nurse on duty. Then I took a seat with my back against the wall, angled so I could see the entrance to the ICU corridor. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my face neutral. I knew if I let emotion rise, my son would try to climb it like a ladder. He arrived less than 20 minutes later. Brian came in looking like he had slept in his clothes, stubble on his jaw, hair flattened in strange places. His eyes moved fast, scanning the room, scanning the desk, scanning the hallway, as if he could spot a way around the rules if he looked hard enough. When he saw me, his shoulders tightened. He walked over with quick steps and stopped in front of my chair. "They told me I can't go back there," he said. "They said I'm not on the list." "What is that supposed to mean?" I looked up at him the way I used to when he was 16 and trying to talk his way out of a consequence. "It means you cannot see her right now," I said. His jaw flexed. He leaned in a little. "You can't do this, Dad. That's my wife. She's also a patient," I said. "And she's a human being you left alone." The words hit him like a slap. He straightened, then started talking quickly, as if speed could turn excuses into truth. He said the hospital makes him panic. He said the alarms, the smell, the waiting, it all makes his chest tighten. He said he felt useless sitting there while she faded. He said he was trying to stay sane. He said he was drowning and nobody cared. Then he moved to money. Bills, late notices, a payday loan he took out when work slowed, a card he maxed, then another, calls from numbers he didn't recognize, threats, repossession people on him from every side. He said he wasn't sleeping. He said he couldn't think straight. I let him talk. I listened without nodding, without shaking my head. I wanted him to reach the end of his own story. I wanted him to hear the emptiness in it. When he finally slowed, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, like he was trying to erase what he'd said. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said. I asked one question. "Where were you when they brought her in?" His mouth opened, then closed. His eyes flicked toward the vending machines, as if an answer might be printed on the side of a snack wrapper. "I was handling something," he said. I nodded once. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. Then I reached into my bag and took out a thin folder. Paper does not raise its voice. It doesn't have to. I set it on the table between us and opened it slowly. "The SUV is mine," I said. "You no longer have permission to drive it." He started to protest. I lifted my hand slightly, not to humiliate him, just to stop the momentum. "Anything connected to my name is protected now," I said. "You can't borrow against it. You can't move it. You can't use it as leverage." He stared at the pages like they might dissolve if he looked long enough. Then I turned to the next sheet. "The hospital has an approved visitor list," I said. "Laura is incapacitated. There are documented concerns. Until further notice, you are not authorized to enter the ICU without permission." He looked up fast. "You can't do that," he said. "You're not her husband." "I'm the one sitting with her," I said, "while you're somewhere else." His breathing changed, shallow, uneven. The anger he came in with slipped, and something raw showed through. "You're trying to ruin me," he said. "I'm not ruining you," I said. "I'm removing the safety net you've been using while you let other people fall." He swallowed. His eyes looked wet, but he blinked it away quickly, like tears were an insult. Then his voice softened, pleading. "I'll change," he said. "I'll go to counseling. I'll come every day. I'll do whatever you want. Just undo it. Please." I watched him and felt something heavy settle in my chest. Not satisfaction, not victory. Grief, sharp and quiet. Because I wanted to believe him. I wanted the version of this where my son hit the bottom and stood up. But I had learned how easily he could say the right words when he needed something. He reached for another angle, desperate now. "You're my father," he said. "You're supposed to have my back. Blood is blood. You can't choose her over your own son." The line landed not because it was persuasive, but because it was the last lever he had left. He was trying to turn our shared name into a shield. I kept my voice low. Being your father doesn't mean I cover for you, I said. It means I tell you the truth. He shook his head like he couldn't accept it. If she dies, he said, and his voice cracked on the word, if she dies and I didn't get to see her, you'll have done that. You'll have taken that from me. For a moment, he looked younger, almost like the boy who used to reach for my hand outside a clinic room. The memory came up so fast it hurt. Him at 8 years old, afraid of needles, trying to be brave, looking at me for permission to fall apart. Then the moment passed, and the resentment returned, hardening his face. This is all your fault, he said. You always needed to be right. I felt the loss of something I had been holding on to without realizing it. Not my patience, not my anger, something else. The belief that the man in front of me would eventually choose responsibility if given enough chances. I closed the folder and slid it toward him. Read it, I said. Sit with it. The rules have changed because you forced them to. He didn't pick it up at first. He stared at it like it was a verdict. A nurse walked by and glanced at us, then kept moving. The hospital went on indifferent to what was happening in one corner of a waiting room. Brian finally put his fingertips on the folder and flipped a page. Then another. He wasn't reading for meaning. He was hunting for a loophole. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the paper. He tried to speak, but no words came. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. It was not the silence of reflection. It was the silence of a man realizing he had nothing left to trade. I sat there and understood something I did not want to understand. Setting a boundary with your child feels like losing them even when it is the only honest thing left to do. Brian lifted his gaze to mine. There was no fight left in it. Just calculation, fear, and disbelief. He knew it then. Not in a dramatic way, in a practical one. He had lost every lever he thought he had. The days after that confrontation felt quieter, but they were not calm. The hospital kept its steady rhythm. Bright lights that never softened. Soft footsteps in the hallway. The familiar beeping that made time feel like it belonged to machines instead of people. What changed was the air around me. The way staff spoke with a little more caution. The way I could feel eyes on my back when I walked past the desk. Brian did not call for 2 days. When he finally did, his voice sounded scraped down by reality. Not angry, not apologetic either. Just tired, like he had been sleeping in short bursts and waking up in a world that no longer obeyed him. He asked what he had to do to get back on the list. I told him the list was not about him. It was about Laura. He started to argue, then stopped. I could hear him breathing like he wanted to say something softer, but did not trust it. He ended the call without a goodbye. I went back to sitting beside Laura, watching her face for signs that she was still fighting. On the 7th morning since she arrived, her eyes opened for a few seconds. Not wide, not fully awake, but open. She looked past me, at first confused, then her gaze found my face and held there like it recognized something safe. I leaned forward and said her name quietly. Careful. Steady. Her lips moved. No sound came out. She tried again, a small effort that cost her more than it looked. Karen stepped in and adjusted a setting on the monitor, then told me Laura's throat was raw from the breathing tube. It would take time. Laura's eyes shifted toward the chair by the wall where her things were stacked. The small bag I brought. A sweater folded neatly. A notebook sitting on top. She looked at it like proof she had not been erased. I nodded because I understood. That afternoon, Rachel called to say the hospital requested a meeting. Not a crisis meeting. A planning meeting. Laura was improving enough that her wishes could be documented properly, and there were decisions that needed to be made while she was clear. We met in a small conference room down the hall from the ICU. A social worker sat with us, a case manager, a patient advocate. People who had seen families fall apart and still kept their voices level. No one treated me like a hero. No one treated Brian like a villain. They treated Laura like the person who mattered. Laura was brought in on a chair wrapped in a blanket, her face pale but present. She looked smaller than she did at family dinners, but her eyes were steady. That steadiness made the room feel different. It reminded me that even when a body is weak, a person can still choose. Rachel asked if Laura felt strong enough to talk. Laura nodded once. The social worker explained what they needed. Confirmation of who could make medical decisions if Laura could not speak again. Documentation of her preferences. A clear visitor list. A clear point of contact. Laura listened with her eyes half closed at times, conserving energy. When it was her turn, she spoke slowly. Her voice was thin but firm in a way that surprised even the staff. She said she wanted me listed as her primary contact for now. She said she did not want Brian making decisions about her care. The room went quiet. Not shocked. Respectful. The kind of silence that follows a truth spoken plainly. The case manager reminded her gently that spouses typically hold that role. Laura nodded again. She reached for the pen. Her hand trembled slightly, but she held it. She signed her name with care, each letter deliberate. Rachel slid the next page toward her and explained it in a low voice. Laura asked one question, and it was the question that told me she had been carrying something heavy long before the ICU. Will this keep him from pressuring me? Rachel said yes, as much as paper can. Laura signed again. Watching her do it filled me with relief and sadness at the same time. Relief that she was taking control. Sadness that she needed protection from the man who was supposed to be her shelter. After the meeting, I walked her back toward her room. She insisted on taking a few steps on her own instead of being pushed the entire way. Pride can be quiet too. When she finally lay back down, her breathing sounded tired but stable. She looked at me for a long moment, then whispered my name clearly enough that it caught in my throat. I leaned closer and told her I was here. Her eyes filled slightly. She swallowed and spoke in broken pieces. He hasn't been here. It was not a question. It was confirmation. Like she already knew but needed to hear it said out loud so she could stop blaming herself for not seeing it sooner. I told her no, not once. Her eyes closed briefly. When they opened again, the sadness behind them was old. She said she kept telling herself there had to be a reason, something she missed, something she did wrong. She said she told herself if she could just get through this, he would come back to being the man she married. I told her she did nothing wrong. She turned her face slightly toward the window, and her breathing hitched once, then steadied. When she spoke again, her voice was flat, like she was trying not to fall apart. I just wanted him to sit with me. That was all. I held her hand and stayed quiet. There was nothing I could say that would make that kind of absence hurt less. Outside that room, the consequences kept spreading. That same week, an email came through to Laura's account, one she had asked me to check for medical updates. It was a message from Brian's workplace benefits department copied to him, reminding him about documentation for family medical leave. The tone was polite. The meaning was not. They were asking for proof. People had started to question the story he told. Later that day, Ethan Caldwell called me again. His voice sounded careful, like he did not want to be pulled into anything, but could not keep pretending he had not seen it. He told me Brian had missed a meeting with a major client. Not rescheduled. Missed. He told me a supervisor had asked Brian directly if he was actually at the hospital like he claimed. He told me the room went quiet when Brian snapped back. He told me sympathy was starting to dry up because stories don't hold when the math doesn't work. The brave husband narrative was cracking. Too many gaps. Too many days when no one saw him anywhere near the ICU. Then came the family pressure. Thomas Reed called twice. I did not answer. He sent a message saying I was tearing the family apart. Another relative sent something long about forgiveness and blood and how people make mistakes when they are scared. Someone else said I was doing the right thing, but warned me to be careful, as if the truth needed managing. I read every message. I did not reply. I used to believe you could explain your way out of misunderstandings. I used to believe that if people knew the facts, they would choose fairness. Age teaches you that most people choose the story that makes them comfortable, not the one that is true. I could not control what they thought. I could only control what I did. Still, there were nights when I drove home and felt the weight of what I had done settle into the passenger seat beside me. Setting a boundary with your child comes with a cost most people do not talk about. You may do the right thing and still lose them. Laura improved in small increments, a few spoonfuls of broth, a longer stretch sitting up without getting dizzy. She asked for her notebook and wrote shaky lines, questions for the doctor, reminders for herself. Watching her write felt like watching someone rebuild after a storm, one board at a time. One evening, after a long day of tests, she asked me to open the blinds. The sky outside had turned orange, then purple, the kind of sunset people photograph and share. In that room it looked private, almost sacred. I opened the blinds and sat back down. Laura watched the sky for a while. Then she turned her head toward me. She did not speak. She did not have to. Her hand rested on the blanket near mine. I placed my hand close, not touching at first, then lightly. She did not pull away. She simply let it be. In that quiet, I felt the shift as clearly as I felt my own heartbeat. The power Brian thought he had was gone. Not because I took it for myself, but because Laura had finally taken it back. I stayed until the sky went dark and the room lights came on. When I left that night, I did it with a steady knowledge that whatever came next would not be decided by fear or guilt. It would be decided by truth, and my son was going to have to face it, whether he was ready or not. A year passed without announcing itself. No sharp turn, no grand marker. Just seasons moving the way they always do when you let them. The hospital visits faded into memory. The quiet routines returned. I sold another small piece of the company, kept the rest steady, and settled back into mornings that began with coffee on the porch in Plano and ended with the sun dropping low over the neighborhood. Laura did not come back to the life she had before. She built a new one. She moved into a small apartment near the park, close enough to walk when her legs felt strong and close enough to sit when they did not. She went to physical therapy 3 times a week. She took classes online. She learned how to cook again without rushing. The scars faded slower than she wanted, but they faded. The fear took longer, but even that loosened its grip. The marriage ended quietly. No shouting, no spectacle. Papers signed with steady hands. Laura asked for nothing that wasn't hers. She kept her name. She kept her dignity. When it was done, she did not look back. We spoke every few weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less. Not out of obligation, but because we understood each other now in a way we never had before. She did not call me her savior. I did not call myself anything at all. We talked about books, about weather, about small victories like walking an extra block, or sleeping through the night without waking up afraid. Brian disappeared from my daily life the way he once disappeared from the hospital. Quietly. At first, There were messages. Then there were none. I did not search for updates. I did not ask around. Whatever consequences followed him were no longer mine to manage. The first time I saw him again was by accident. I was at a grocery store not far from my house, standing in the checkout line with a basket that held more vegetables than it used to. I noticed him because he stood too still, because he kept his eyes on the floor like he did not want to be recognized. He was thinner, older. The confidence that once wrapped around him like a coat was gone. His clothes looked worn in a way that had nothing to do with fashion. He looked up when he heard my voice talking to the cashier. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he stepped closer, uncertain, like a man approaching a door he was not sure would open. He said my name quietly. I nodded. We walked outside together. The sun was bright, the parking lot loud with carts and engines. For a few seconds we stood there without knowing where to put our hands. He told me he was working nights at a warehouse. Temporary work. Nothing steady. He told me the apartment he shared with roommates was loud and cramped. He told me he was trying to get back on his feet. He did not mention Laura. He asked if we could talk sometime. He said he needed help. Just a little. To get through the next few months. I listened. I always listened. When he finished, he waited, eyes searching my face for something he recognized. An opening. A habit. The old reflex that used to kick in when he said he needed me. It did not come. I told him I was glad he was working. I told him I hoped he stayed with it. I told him I wished him well. Then I told him I could not help him. Not with money, not with favors, not with fixing what he had broken. He looked at me like he did not understand the language I was speaking. He said he was my son. I said, I know. He said, people make mistakes. I said, they do. He waited for the rest. There was no rest. I told him I would not interfere with the life he was building now, for better or worse. That was his responsibility. He asked if this was punishment. I told him no. This was the absence of protection, a difference most people do not understand until it arrives. For a moment I saw anger rise. Then something else pushed it aside. Exhaustion. Acceptance. Maybe both. He nodded once. Not agreement. Understanding. We said goodbye in the way people do when they realize something has ended and something else will never return. I drove home with the groceries, sitting in the back seat, the weight of the conversation settling into place without drama. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, just a quiet sense that the line I drew had held. That evening, I sat on the porch as the light faded and thought about the word destruction. People imagine it as something loud, something violent, something that leaves debris everywhere. Sometimes it is none of those things. Sometimes it is a decision made in a calm voice followed through without anger. Sometimes it is the end of shelter, the removal of a hand that keeps catching you before you fall. I did not destroy my son. I stopped standing between him and the consequences of his choices. Laura sent me a message later that week. A photo of her standing in the park, hair pulled back, sunlight on her face. She looked steady, present, alive in a way that had nothing to do with survival. I looked at that photo for a long time. There are moments in life when love means stepping in, and there are moments when love means stepping back so someone can finally face themselves. If this story made you uncomfortable, that may be because you have stood on one side of that line or the other, or because one day you will. If you have ever wondered where the boundary is between loyalty and responsibility, or how far love should go before it becomes harm, take a moment to sit with that question. And if you want to hear more stories about the choices that shape us long after the noise fades, stay here. Sometimes the quiet decisions are the ones that change everything.